Hey race fans, and welcome back to the channel. My name's Simon, and today's video will be focused on optimizing your iRacing graphics setup. We'll walk through the basics, I'll provide my perspective on how you can get the most out of your hardware, and I'll also share with you some invaluable online resources which you can use as you continue to tweak your setup. This video will be part of a larger series dedicated to iRacing setup and getting the most out of your system, and we'll be covering other topics such as HUDs, overlays, trading paints, audio settings, base shakers, you name it. So if you get a chance, feel free to check out the other videos in the series. Okay, let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to take a look at are a couple of key .ini files that iRacing uses and updates regularly that contain all of the graphics settings that drive your iRacing system. It's key to understand where they're stored, mainly so that if you ever need to make edits within the files, they're easy to find, but most importantly, so that you can make regular backups of these files, so that if anything happens with your system, it's easy to copy these files back and you can get back to a previous state of graphics settings without having to go through the whole setup process from the beginning. So right now I'm in my documents folder. I'm going to double click into iRacing. This is the master iRacing folder, and if I scroll down to the bottom, there's a couple of key files I just want you to pay attention to. The first one is App.ini, and that has a couple of key graphics settings that we'll have a chat through later, and then also these renderer DX11 files, and you'll notice there's 4 of them in total, and depending on how you run iRacing, I just run on a monitor, so therefore this renderer DX11 monitor file is the key one for me. But if you are running in virtual reality, then either the OpenVR or the Oculus renderer DX11 file is likely to be the one for you. There might be times when you need to directly edit these .ini files. Typically that happens when there's a setting you're trying to adjust which isn't accessible by the iRacing UI, so you need to come into the files themselves and make the change there. So we'll quickly show you how to do that. I'll use the App.ini file for my example. Super easy, you just right click on it, go to open with, go to Notepad, and then it will open it in an editable document. Once you've made the change that you need to make, then you can just hit Control Save, close the file, and then you're good to go. Okay, so we're now in the iRacing UI, and there's a couple of scenarios why you might want to run the graphics configurator here. First one would be if you're a brand new user, this is the best thing to do to get your system up and running so it can handle iRacing. It might not optimize all the settings, but you're able to get into the sim and get things moving. The second scenario is you might have run into problems with your graphics. Perhaps iRacing has pushed out an update and it has brought down your FPS or just created some issues whilst you're in the sim. This is a great first thing to do to try and get rid of those initial issues. So the place to find the graphics configurator is down here in settings, bottom left. Jump to the interface tab on the right, and then here you'll see the graphics config button. So I'll go ahead and hit that. Then we get shown this menu. This is a really important step for those of you who might run integrated graphics as part of your CPU. It's really important to make sure you select your discrete GPU in the list. It should be obvious for me, it's an RTX 4090, so I'm going to select that. And then what you do is you just hit auto configure and it'll run a program in the background to basically set up the graphic settings in what it believes to be the most optimal way for your system. Then we get the second box here. This is asking you to select a graphics mode. It's usually going to give you different resolutions, whether you want to run in HDR, what your hertz of your monitor is. I'm going to leave this as the default for me, 2560 x 1440. That is my center panel, and 144 hertz is the refresh rate of this monitor, so that's bang on. You have options here to run in a window instead of full screen. These are things that we can configure later once we get into the in-sim iRacing graphics settings, so I'm going to leave these as they are for now. Okay, so I've now loaded a test session. We're at Mount Panorama, and this is where we'll do the bulk of the graphics configuration within the sim. Before we get started though, there was one document that I think is really important to point out. There's an iRacing VR optimization guide, which is posted and then regularly updated on the iRacing forums. The link will be in the comment section below. And this is a brilliant document to understand all of the different iRacing graphics settings, their different impacts on the CPU and GPU. And whilst it's a guide that's focused on optimization for people who are using VR headsets, the information in that document is extremely useful for all of us, including those of us that are running on monitors, be that single screen or triple screen. So please do take the time to check that out. Okay, so let's jump into the in-sim graphics options. We'll head over to the top right, click options, and then we'll click the graphic tab. Now there's two tabs in the options menu that will impact how iRacing renders the game whilst you're in the sim. This graphic tab, any changes that you make here will change how you see the graphics whilst you're driving the car around the track. And then the replay tab will impact how you see the game when you're either spectating or looking at a replay. The graphics tab is split up into two: display and performance. The display portion at the top is focused on resolution and some other specific settings around your monitors. I'm not going to go into tons of detail in this today because this is more focused on monitor setup, field of view, and other elements connected with that, and I will have a separate video on that shortly to talk through that. Today we're going to focus on the performance section underneath, as this is where you can make the biggest impact in terms of graphics settings and changes to really optimize how iRacing runs on your system. Now what you're seeing on the screen is actually the current settings that I run with, and so that you have a bit of a baseline, my setup is a 5900X CPU paired with a 4090 GPU, so it's a relatively high-end system. But the first thing you'll notice if you look at the left-hand side is there's plenty of settings around sky, PID objects, grandstands and crowds, which are not set to their maximum. And this is a really important thing to consider. Is you may love the eye candy when you're driving and you want that, but it's all about making the decision to get your frames per second as high as they can be whilst not losing any visual fidelity of the things that actually matter and the things that you'll see a lot whilst you're on track. So for me, down this left-hand column, sky and clouds can be quite resource heavy, so I bump that down to medium. The cars I keep at high detail. That matters a lot for me when I'm driving. I like to see them in high resolution. The PID objects I bring down just because PID objects, especially in big races with big fields, can be a real drain on both CPU and GPU drawing resources. Grandstands, crowds are another two areas in low detail. It's something I really enjoy seeing the depth and detail around, but honestly when I'm driving the car, I think this is just wasting FPS if I put these at a high setting, so I've dropped them down to low, and in honestly, when I did that, I really didn't notice too much of a difference. Beneath that, we have particles. I keep that at high detail in full resolution and soft. These can affect things such as fireworks at the ends of races, so I like to keep these high. I don't feel that it's too much of an impact on performance. Max cars, I have this set to 63, primarily because I use RaceLab software, and in order for the telemetry to work accurately, this needs to be set to 63, so that's why I have it that way. And the settings beneath that, dynamic LOD, these are things that I haven't changed, and they are just at the default settings. Now the frame rate right at the bottom, you'll see I have no limit, but again in a separate video I'll talk about the G-Sync and V-Sync setup that I'm running at the moment, which effectively will cap the frame rate that I run here to just below 144, which is the hertz for my 3 monitors. So as we look at this middle column of settings, there are a couple here that can really negatively impact your frame rate, so things to keep an eye on. First one, AA samples. Anything higher than 4x here is going to be a real challenge for CPU, GPU, so keep an eye on that. Potentially set it to below 4x depending on how your system is performing. Looking at shadow maps, dynamic objects, night shadow maps. Anything to do with shadows typically is going to be hard work for a system to process. So I've played around with these settings a lot since I got on the system, and I've adjusted them again as I've updated my hardware. And for my current setup, I find this rate of shadows to be acceptable. I used to run dynamic objects. I felt that was too taxing for the frame rate, so I've taken that off, and I didn't notice much of an impact. And then a couple of key ones right at the bottom, the dynamic cube maps and fixed cube maps. These are extremely big resource hogs and are not optimized currently in the system. So recommendation for me and just about anyone else would be to set these at 0 for now until iRacing provides better optimizations. The last one there, shader quality, can be ultra detail, doesn't have a huge impact on frame rate, so that's great to keep the quality on that setting high. Okay, so let's talk the settings in the right hand column. First up we have trees. Personally, I really appreciate the visual fidelity of the trees, especially as iRacing has optimized it over the last 1 to 2 years. So I keep all of these settings on for me. Just bear in mind for your system, and especially at certain tracks where there's a lot of foliage that you see as you're driving around, this can be very taxing on systems. So it's a great way to save some frames if you need to. Looking at mirrors, you'll see that my settings, I actually have all of the mirrors off and I just run a virtual mirror at the moment. Now that's primarily a decision based on streaming, where I stream my center screen and therefore individuals that are watching the stream can't see the side mirrors anyway. So I've just adjusted to using a single virtual mirror at the top of my screen. Again, it's very much user preference, but just know the more mirrors that you have enabled whilst you're driving, again, more rendering for your GPU. So if you want to save some frames, cutting that down to just one mirror or to the virtual mirror can really make a difference for your system. The settings right at the bottom, anti-aliasing, I would recommend that's kept off. If you put any setting into there, it will just increase the processing and it just adds more work for the CPU and GPU. And I've played around with it. I don't see a huge effect from a visual perspective, so I've kept that off. And then sharpening, HDR, distortion, heat haze. Again, I would say personal preference. Each one of those is going to add a little bit extra processing for your system. So play around with the settings, see what works for you. I've got it set with sharpening, HDR and distortion on. That works great for me. I didn't really enjoy the heat haze when I switched that on, and I felt it cost too much resources, but depends what works for you. And then finally, the car textures. I think this is really important to have on. This is how you get the really high quality looking cars as you're driving around. So I would always recommend keeping this on and adjusting some of the other graphics settings if you're still struggling with those frame rates. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 sliders that you see on the screen here. Top one is super simple. By moving that left and right, it's just a bunch of pre-configured iRacing graphics settings, which if you just want to get right out on track when you've installed iRacing, great, just go ahead and do that. Pull it all the way to the right to prioritize frame rate and lower graphics fidelity. Pull it all the way to the left to get more quality around visual fidelity. But as we've been doing, the best thing to do is to really go through these settings one by one, look at the result when you get out on track, and then decide which is best for you. The 2 sliders at the bottom are super important and ones to pay attention to because they might not always be set to the right setting when you first boot into iRacing. The top one is around GPU memory. This is effectively telling iRacing how much of your GPU VRAM it should use up to what the maximum is. I have a 4090 that has 24 gigabytes of VRAM, so I can pull this slider all the way to the right because the maximum is only 16 gigabytes. So that leaves plenty of room for me in my GPU for other tasks should I need it. The bottom slider is focused on your RAM in your system. My system has 32 gigs of RAM, so I have this set to just under 22 gigs, which is roughly about 2/3, and basically is telling iRacing it can use up to 22 gigabytes of my RAM, but it must leave the other 10 gigabytes available for other system processes. And that's really the recommendation for both of these, is make sure that there is some margin. Around 1/3 is a good rule of thumb of memory left for other systems and processes. Otherwise you will experience some lagginess when you're playing the game. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the replay tab. And as a reminder, when you're in the replay tab and you're looking at those settings, that's going to affect what you see when you're either spectating or looking at replays. It will not adjust the graphics settings for when you're in the car and driving it around. So we'll hit replay, and one of the first things to mention is just in this bottom left here where it says renderer dx11 monitor.ini. That exists on both the graphic tab and the replay tab, and is super useful because it's telling you which of those .ini files that we looked at earlier inside File Explorer that this is actually impacting and adjusting. Very useful to know so that you don't get confused, because there are multiple dx11 renderer.ini files, so always take a quick look at that to know that if you need to make any manual adjustments to those files, you know which one iRacing is using whilst you're in the sim. So let's talk about how the philosophy for the replay tab differs from the graphic tab. The graphic tab, you're focused on frames per second. That's your priority. You're trying to build as much visual fidelity as you can, but whilst maintaining a frame rate which is acceptable for you. Now in the replay tab, you can take a few more liberties. Anything between 30 and 60 frames per second is going to look great on a replay or streamed or posted, so you don't have to focus so much here on frames per second, and you can up some of the settings so that your replays and your screenshots really can look sharp and with a high visual fidelity. So let's take a look at how I've adjusted my settings from the graphic tab to the replay tab. The first thing you'll notice is that I still don't have everything maxed out to high, despite running a 4090 and a fairly powerful system. I have the sky clouds, the PID objects, and the crowds only set to medium detail. And this is because when I have been streaming other people's races as a spectator, maybe it's a night race or a 24-hour race with a lot of cars on track, I've noticed that my frame rate can dip below 30 frames per second, which of course does impact the quality of the screen. So I've played with these settings and I felt that this is a good balance. By bringing the sky clouds, PID objects, and crowds down to medium gives me a good balance where the visual quality is still very high, but it is giving me a little bit extra around frame rate and trying to keep things above 60 frames per second. So if we look at the middle and then the right hand column of settings, the first thing is there's less settings to alter here than the graphic tab, so that's great, makes things a little bit simpler. The shadow settings that I have in the middle column are exactly the same as on the graphic tab. I feel no need to add any more complexity here around GPU, CPU processing, so I keep them exactly the same. I'm quite happy with the visual fidelity that I see. And then on the right hand side, same for the trees, have them set to on as I do in the graphic tab, but the only difference I make here is I do add on all the mirrors. I quite like it when I'm watching or sitting in someone else's car whilst they're driving. I quite enjoy having that immersion of the mirrors on, and again, I'm not chasing frame rate when I'm in a replay or when I'm spectating someone else's race, so I'm happy to have all four mirrors on even if the frame rate is dipping as low as kind of 50-60 frames per second. For me, that's quite okay. The settings at the bottom, again, it's very similar to the previous screen. I have the sharpening effect on, I have the distortion effect on. I still don't add the heat haze, again, just for me doesn't add a huge amount of value, but very much personal preference for you. That might be something important that you like to see, especially when you're running on a hot track. So that's it in terms of the graphic settings that you can configure whilst you're in the sim in iRacing. Now, I haven't gone into a ton of detail per graphic setting around the impact on CPU and GPU, and that's on purpose. I'd love for you to go and take a look at Robert Ehrling's VR optimization guide. Again, link will be in the description below. Robert does a fantastic job of talking through the specific impact of every one of those settings, and that will help you make a more informed choice as to what setting you want to set it on depending on your system. It might be focused on VR optimization, but there's such a wealth of information in that document that it is a fantastic one to read, to absorb, to understand, and then to use that when you come into the options to make those final adjustments to get the frame rate working and the graphics fidelity to the level that you're looking for. So I have three final recommendations for you of changes that we can make just to squeeze a bit more performance out of your system. The first is an App.ini settings change. The second is a change in the NVIDIA control panel, assuming you are using an NVIDIA GPU. And then the third is switching off a particular Windows service that can consume a little bit of RAM, which if freed up is something that then iRacing can use. So on the app.ini file, you are looking for a setting called show join leave. This setting controls the player join and leave messages, and if the CPU is under particularly heavy use, this can cause stutters, so it's a great thing to turn off. If we take a look at the NVIDIA control panel, this might be a setting that is already switched on for you, which if so, great. But you want to go to Manage 3D Settings, you want to scroll down, and what you're looking for is the Power Management mode, and you want that selected to prefer maximum performance. Again, just to tell the GPU to deliver the maximum performance it can with the power that it has available. And then finally, there is a Windows service. So if you search for services, you'll get a screen like this. This service is related to the quick starting of apps, which can be great. But from an iRacing and a gaming perspective, this is something that will consume a little bit of memory, and there's no real need for it. When you're racing, you're not constantly opening apps, everything is stable. So if you can save a little bit of resources by turning this service off, then it's a win for whilst you're in the sim. And what you're looking for is a service called sysmain, SYSMAIN. You'll see for me it's already disabled and the service is stopped. If you haven't changed this, this will be an active service that will be running. And what you can do is just come into startup type, hit disabled. If the service is running, you can hit stop, and then that will prevent the service from restarting the next time you boot up your PC. That's all for this one. Hopefully the video has given you some ideas of how you can optimize the graphic settings for your particular iRacing setup. Let us know in the comments if you have any thoughts or suggestions. Check back frequently for more iRacing setup guides, and if there's something that you don't see that you'd like us to cover, just give us a shout. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the grid.